There it is. Oh my God, he's wearing a different shirt. I know fat guys are not supposed to wear striped shirts though, right? That's a problem. How you doing there this evening? Oh, metaphysics versus religion. This video is not about that, by the way. I'm never interested in discussing metaphysics versus religion. Self-identity. You know, wouldn't it be great if we could actually have the secrets to things? Like we spend, someone that's a true expert on something, whatever that may be. Yeah, it could be like a really difficult topic. Be able to make a paraphrasable core and stick it into something where they could basically tell you the gist of the entire thing within an hour, depending on what the subject is, maybe half an hour, maybe even less than a half an hour. What if that were possible? You see people at the bookstore that buy all sorts of goofy books written by gurus and masters, and they'll end up flapping their lips endlessly, and they didn't say anything. Unless we're going to talk about this, and maybe it's just one topic. I have books like that. I've got one neat 340-page book about Anakin, the Greek word of the Anakin. And you think a 340-page book would be able to tell you what that was about. And yet, it never does. It gives you, well, it occurs over here, and it seems to have the context like that, and it occurs over here, and this, of course, is one of those silly academic books. You know, tell you what Anakin means really simply. It doesn't require 343 pages. You can't get a single answer of any scientist or physicist as to what a field is. You could ask every one of them, excuse me, sir, what's a field? You might get a wrong answer, which is what they've been trained to say. So, well, a field is lines of force. Well, force is not a thing. Force is something done by something upon something else. I mean, there's no such thing as force itself. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing. Lines is a conceptual human abstraction. These are only seen due to the constructive and destructive interference of fields. Tell you simply what a field is. Field's an ether perturbation modality. Anyway, getting on to really the deepest part of actual metaphysics, and I'm sorry I led up with that. I'm going to edit that out of that video, the first 2 minutes of this video. Talking about the self versus the self. Yeah? And I have talked about this endlessly, but I like to make it really, really, really simple. Because if we actually think about it, and, don't take my word for it. I mean, the best mind is one that will hear something and they'll process it in their own head. And hopefully you have a logical mind. You can be able to discern whether it's true or not. Is that there's no such thing as purification of a transcendent self. Well, what's the process then necessitatively? There must, of course, be a process. And there must be. But can we all agree that gold is gold is gold? Gold is never purified. It is extracted. Well, of course, we don't use the word dilution regarding metal so far as its host rock, but say certain mini gold places will actually take a giant 2 tons of gold ore, and they'll get like 1 ounce of gold out of it, and 2 tons of gold ore, just to get one tiny little troy ounce, which is really not much bigger than this coin. So we're talking about dilution, but we don't use the word dilution regarding metals, but we don't need to take that analogy too far. So there's no such thing as purification of the transcendent self, as in the ancient passage, tat tvamasi, that thou art, meaning the absolute, meaning, of course, the transcendent self, or aham brahmasmi, thou art Brahman, i.e. the absolute. So, not purified, rather extracted. What's the opposite of dilution? Wouldn't that be concentration? Now, when you say concentration, then people immediately have the idea of sitting there in the lotus position, blanking out your mind, which, of course, is technically concentration, but we're not talking about the process in this video. So, what do we actually mean? Self is identity, the transcendent self with a big capital S, right? Every other self, that thing we actually see in the mirror when we brush our teeth and stuff like that. Yeah, and I hate it when people use the word ego. Not that I really care, but egoism, egoity, ahamsami doesn't actually mean ego or egoity. It's a relatively modern creation from Western existentialists. This idea of egotism and egoity, it's not found in ancient Pali. Ahamsami does not mean egotism. And yet a lot of people actually believe that, but we're not interested in discussing that either. This existential self, which of course you changed your beliefs and your ideas, since you were young. Now really ignorant people do not. They'll actually stick to one thing. It'll be like the same thing in their old age as it was when they were a teenager. These people are not that intelligent, but 99% of everybody else, they kind of change their ideas and their beliefs as they grow and mature and they learn stuff, and they realize that the world and nature on the whole is a lot different than people living inside their own little nutshells, sniffing their own flatulence, which is what a lot of people, most people, actually do. They live in an echo chamber where they sniff their own beliefs and their own irrational ideas. And of course, the one thing I've said in many countless videos is that nobody is their beliefs. That's the reason for 99% of suffering and conflict in the world, is that people think they are their beliefs, and when someone else insults their crazy beliefs, like, oh, you insulted me, you've offended me. It's like, no, I actually went after a belief, because you are not your beliefs. But people believe that. I mean, that's what they see in the mirror. Anyway, that self, that transient self, which is ever-changing, which the ancient Pali compares it to the phases of the moon, it's ever in flux. That's process. Okay? On the one hand, we have the self, which is unchanging, everlasting, transcendent, and we have the other self, which is process. It is never the same thing. It is ever in perpetual flux. And people confuse these two things, especially Buddhists, by the way, and I've been debating them for decades. They'll actually say, oh, is it Buddhism rejects the self? Yeah, it doesn't reject this self. It calls this self the jyoti, or light, the only refuge, atasarana, nanasarana, the transcendent. The only thing that's actually called permanent, or nityam in the ancient Pali, is of course that transcendent self. I'm not here to debate the self, the permanent self, the transcendent self in original Buddhism, because it is palpably there. It is undeniable and irrefutable. I've debated the best in the world on this topic for 20 years. Every one of them is lost. They'll keep bringing up things in regards to the transient self, which is process. And you're exactly right, except you're talking about the transient self. This teaching is found in the Bhagavad Gita, it's found in the Vedas, it's found in the principal Upanishads. You keep going after this self, but we're talking about the transcendent self, which is called the light, the permanent, the only refuge. So they have not got a clue. They have not even got a single clue. So that self, not the transcendent self, the self that you see in the mirror, is perpetual process. It's ever-changing over time, of course, for most people. Like I said, slightly less, let's just call them unwise people. They don't change their beliefs, and they don't change that process as to what they think they are, or what they identify with. And most people in the world, whether they be intelligent or not, and there's a huge difference between empirical knowledge, i.e. episteme, and wisdom. Everybody keeps talking about knowledge and IQ tests. This is well and fine, but the least impressive people I've ever found in life are highly educated. I spent 6 years in college. It doesn't mean anything. Intelligence is one thing, wisdom is another. Self-nodding, neti, via negativa, is of course the same as self-realization, self with a capital S. Objective, if you get nothing, if you want to understand the deepest aspects of true metaphysics, both Greek and Indian, learn this. Okay, are you ready? There's no self which is permanent that is objective. Objective negation, this is the important part actually, objective negation leads to subjective synthesis. The self always precedes, subject always precedes objective negation, I'm always thinking about 1,000 things at once. That's one of the downfalls of being a deep thinker, actually. Subject precedes objective negation. There is no such thing as self-denial. This spiritual nihilism can't be enjoined. It's impossible. It's also, too, logically impossible. You can't even have a debate about it. Wisdom and the self are one and the same thing. And when I refer to the self, I'm talking about the self with a capital S. There is no distinction between self-proximity and the self itself. That is self-realization, self-nodding, the via negativa, the apophatism. Yeah, you're familiar with that word? That's actually the second half of my name on YouTube here, Theoria Apophasis, which just means synthesis through objective negation. Wisdom and the self are one and the same thing. People talk endless, well, actually, meaning people like me, I don't hear anybody talking about wisdom anymore, unfortunately. When's the last time you heard someone use the word wisdom other than myself? The answer is almost never. Wisdom and the self are one and the same thing. This is self-proximity. So there's no purification of the transcendent self. What, therefore, then, is the process? We can talk endlessly about the process. I have talked endlessly about the process in countless different videos. What's the opposite of dilution? Let's try not to use the word concentration. So, what is self-realization with a capital S? Wisdom is self-realization. Self-realization is wisdom. That is a complete disobjectification with the existential self, the persona non grata. The broadcast is not the signal. The absence of modulation is not a signal at all. No radio on Earth can tune an unmodulated signal. What do you think the implication for that is? Rather than just listening to this video, why don't you stop it every 30 seconds and think about that? Because when you think about it deeply and truly, then you make it your own. It's like, is this true or not? You know? Logically, necessitatively, it must be so that it is that way. You might have that process in your head. So. By the way, also too, physical suffering's end is never and nowhere spoken of. Not in the Upanishads, not in the Gita, not in the Vedas, not in the five Nikayas, the Digha Nikaya, Majjhima, Samyutta, Anguttara Nikaya, Khuddaka Nikaya, Udana, Iribhutaka, Sudanapara, on and on and on and on. Read them all. Translating in Pali, have been now for over 23. Existential, i.e. empirical suffering, is never and nowhere the end thereof ever spoken about. It's never, because it's impossible. Now you can actually remove yourself from that physical suffering to a certain degree, but the end of physical suffering is never spoken about. What sort of suffering are we talking about? We're talking about the end of primordial diagnosis. The primordial diagnosis that you think you're your beliefs, you think you're that thing you see in the mirror when you brush your teeth. Objective negation leads to subjective synthesis. Now let's make it really, really simple. Talk about a couple other aspects here. There's some other passages both in original Buddhism, and by the way, Buddhism, that term didn't even exist until the 16th century. So when I say Buddhism, I'm really referring to nothing other than a neo-Saramanic movement of lost ancient Vedanta. During the time of Sakyamuni Buddha, meaning the Scythian sage, Gautama Siddhartha, i.e. 600 BCE plus, at that time, which 2,500 years ago, they think, oh my God, that's so long ago. Well, it is, relatively. But ultimately, it's not. Even those 2,600 years ago, the message of the Vedas and the principal Upanishads have been completely corrupted. There is absolutely nothing. Every genuine expert of the Vedas, the Upanishads, and of original Buddhist Nikayas, they all say the same thing. There's absolutely not one single frigging thing original or new or novel in so-called earliest Buddhism that you can't find in the Upanishads. Not even one single thing. And let me tell you what, as someone that's been debating these people for decades, the Buddhists, there's nothing that will make them foam at the mouth quicker. Not that I care. I never care about religions. I only care about truth, facts, logic, and wisdom, most importantly, above all else. But throughout these different metaphysics, both the Upanishads, even the Gita, even the Vedas, and the Nikayas, there are a few different passages, and they all say exactly the same thing. Bhava nirodhana bandham, which means the subjugation of becoming equals nirvana. Nirvana is either nirvritti or nisbandhu. Nisbandhu means firm bondage. Nirvritti means no more perturbations, which is most likely the original compound making up the word nirvana. Nirvritti, the ends of perturbation. It's no different than signal modulation, because an unmodulated signal is not only really not a signal, it can't be tuned by any radio. I love using the radio analogy because it's so nearly perfect. It's not entirely perfect, but it's mostly perfect. So here's the passage in the ancient Nikayas that Bhavanirodha Nabhamam, the subjugation of becoming, means nirvana. Also, too, Suvimuta Chatasam Nabhamam, the thoroughly liberated Spiritus Sanctum, or Cheetah, means nirvana. Suvimuta, su means thoroughly, vimuta, liberation. The thoroughly liberated Cheetah, which in the English would be Spiritus Sanctum, the soul. The thoroughly liberated, meaning unmodulated, means nirvritti, no more perturbations. It's a signal without modulation, which is not a signal at all, which would be pure unmanifest energy. In counter space, say, I hate the word counter space, but pick your word. I don't care. Subspace, 0 point, it don't make any difference. I couldn't care less. These are just silly little words we use to talk about things so we could communicate. And this is no different than the so-called Vedic cornerstone statements, which is Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga, meaning synthesis or liberation ultimately. The end goal of yoga is liberation, which is completely undeniable by anybody on this earth. Yoga is, meaning the fruit of yoga, which is liberation, yeah? Vimuta. In the Pali it would be Vimuta. Yoga is the Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Chitta is the same word in Pali. It refers to the Spiritus Sanctum. The nous is the Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Let's dissect that. Vritti is perturbations, yeah? Nirodha, the subjugation of. In other words, the removal of modulation, yeah? The metaphysics of this means is that the removal of modulation, which is primordial diagnosis, or the extrinsic attribute of the absolute, because there ain't no original sin or first cause, i.e. prima causa, in monistic metaphysics. Not Greek, not Indian, not Egyptian either. No. It's not first cause, there ain't no original sin. Yes, I said ain't. It is extrinsic attribute of the absolute. The removal of that, avidya. By the way, the Pali words, ancient Pali and Sanskrit, are so incredibly accurate metaphysically. As far as you dissect the word, yeah? Avidya, translated as ignorance, and I don't mean conventional terrestrial ignorance, meaning transcendent agnosis, before descent, before embodiment. Avidya is the vidya, or light. You translate vidya as light, which it is light. Directed away from itself, which is no different than saying illumination, because illumination is not first cause or original sin either, it's extrinsic attribute of the absolute. So all of these passages say the same thing in only super slight nuanced different ways. Bhavanirodha Nabandham, Suvimuta Chatasana Bandham, and Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. The subjugation of modulation, i.e. the primordial attribute of agnosis, which is transcendent and before embodiment, yeah? Undeniably so in doctrine. 1,000% undeniably so. The subjugation of that and the perturbations thereof, which of course the perturbation and the modulation, the same thing. Perturbation and modulation, the same thing. Totally synonymous, metaphysically speaking. The subjugation and removal of that by wisdom, because wisdom is self-proximity, is liberation, is the fruit of yoga, is nibbana, or nirvritti, the end of perturbation. Nirvritti equals nirvana. Nirvritti, nisbandhu, or nirvana. Doesn't matter if we use the Sanskrit word or the Pali word. All of this is fundamentally simple. This is the primer of all monistic metaphysics, Greek, Indian, Egyptian. The premise behind Plotinus, Proclus, Numenius, Syrianus, Iamblichus, Albinus, on and on and on. The root and fundamentals behind the Parmenides, which confuses these freaking scholars right to the nth degree. Self-nodding is no different than self-realization. Objective, you gotta think about this, like when you're brushing your teeth or maybe you're sitting on the toilet. Objective negation leads to subjective synthesis. There is nowhere, any passage, Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, Vedas, blah, 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 the Nikayas, mention of purification of the transcendent self. There is not. But what's the process for if there's no such thing as purification? Well, think about this once again. You have to think about it. You know, don't just watch this video. Think about it. Make it yours. Gold is never ever purified because gold is gold is gold is gold is gold is gold, right? When we talk about gold purification, we're talking about extraction of one thing from something. It's like if this were like a gold-bearing rock. Oh, I see a couple of flecks of gold there. You know, this rock is worthless even though there might be $20 of gold in this rock. Well, gold is gold is gold, right? So what are we talking about? Well, how do we get the gold out? Yeah? Gold is always gold. We're not purifying the gold by removing it from this rock, are we? For example, analogously. No, we're not. So what's the process? Well, if I were to smash this rock up, send it through chemical processes, another smasher, and we're actually able to apply acid to it, which is sometimes how gold is extracted, you know, then all this rock will dissolve away into mush, and we'll have these little flecks of gold, maybe 20 bucks worth, not that this rock has gold in it. So, what then, therefore, is purification? What then, therefore, is wisdom? What's the opposite of dilution? Dilution due to what? What's the cause of dilution? Primordial Diagnosis, which is transcendent to the existential persona non grata. Bob, Sue, Larry. That psychophysical thing that you see in the mirror when you brush your teeth. All of this within this 15 or 20 minute video, however long or short it is the primer of all metaphysics. The absolute, undeniable primer of metaphysics. Yeah. Took me 20 minutes to say it. It'll take these gurus 1,000 hours, and you got to buy their book, and you got to buy their lecture, blah 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 blah. Yeah, you got to look through 1,000 different books and have a sharp mind just to be able to pull out a couple pearls of like, oh, I get it, and I get a little bit of it anyway. Here's a little pearl of wisdom, like, and maybe another 600 pages might be another pearl. You can say it in 15 minutes. If you don't understand it, then you can't paraphrase it. That is the paraphrasable core and primer of all monistic metaphysics. Period. Mic drop. Well, in this case, it was coin drop. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.